All right, so that was really excellent. Thank you, Nathan. And we're about to get started with the panel. So what we try to do is have more of a story arc. So we're going to try and cover a few things. We've been getting some of your questions, so we'll try to intermingle them. We also have Christian helping us in the audience, like keep an eye on the questions as well. So what we're looking to do is just kind of set the stage, like what are the aspects of trust? Like why does it matter? You could imagine not understanding, like, why this is even a conversation. Like, I get free stuff, you can have my data. How do we end up with these belief systems? And what is the state of trust today? Are there any gaps? And how do we kind of move forward with these systems more? So I guess we'll start with, like, what is this personal information economy, and what are the aspects of it that really matter to people?
Do you want to go?
Sure. So in terms of the personal information economy, we have data that's underlying it all. I don't know that there are a lot of aspects to the general public that they're aware of have a lot of meaning and purpose. However, I do think that they value the freeness of it, and they just don't quite understand at scale what that freeness actually comes with.
The only thing I'd probably add to that is that the personal information economy is going through like evolution cycles. And a gentleman over here mentioned kind of distributed ledger tech earlier, and there are interesting projects like Solid from Tim Berners-Lee and Evernorm and stuff like that. I think what we're seeing right now is almost this inflection point where we might start going in that direction towards a more person-centric personal information economy. Previously, we've had an organizational-centric personal information economy where we've actively participated, but the underlying value mechanisms have been, not really flowing through to us, and I think that's due for a shake-up.
So are there any aspects of this that are kind of generational in terms of like the diffusion of technology over time, or even sort of different perspectives? Like there's might be young people that have a different definition of trust with their parents than with a company. They may be very free with a company to give them all this data in exchange for free stuff. They don't have a lot of money, whereas they keep photos of them doing dumb things on Snapchat because they're very interested in like what their parents don't want to see. So what sort of parts of this will be affected as generations shift, and how much of that will impact?
Let me go? All right.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think, like you just mentioned, the kids sharing everything, it's something where they're born into it, right? So my parents, for example, they don't want anything to do with social media. They don't care. They call their friends on the phone or like send them an email. It's not a big deal. But a whole generation was born into it. I think also on that same note, we will have a whole generation that will have grown up with it, like myself and many people my age, who realize that challenge that we're now hitting and want change. And so I think as the generation gap moves forward, I think we'll see change the same way like my grandpa, who went through the Great Depression, held all this money in cash. We'll have a lot of people who have gone through this rating of data who move forward wanting to have protections and demand change and are literate enough to do so.
I would add to that you see these really interesting generational perspectives, particularly when you do sort of qualitative research across the attitudinal dimension. A large telco in Australia recently introduced us to some of their research, and you had this couple, and I wouldn't specify what I thought their age was to them, but let's call them 70, right? And this lady was like so mature in her perspective, and believed that there were validated reasons to distrust the way that the personal information economy worked. And then on the total other end of the spectrum, there are research firms all around the world that focus specifically on kind of kids and teenagers. And some of them in the EU have done some fascinating research, and actually Cognizant did some really interesting research in the EU, and they had like kids that were like 12 designing control dashboards, high propensity to willingly share their information. They kind of got that was the way that things worked, but they expected to be fully in control, and they literally could design this stuff out. I tried to hire them and realized they were too young. But that is really fascinating. You kind of have these maturity cycles based on people's, generational perspective and experience.
So do you think things will get better, or things will stay the same or worse? Like, there's all these generational aspects, like how much of that will shift? Like sometimes they say, if you want things to change, you just have to wait for the other generation to no longer be active, not to get too morbid about it.
Yeah. I would argue that we can go one of two ways, big surprise. I think if we want to go towards a more person-centric future, we have to design for it and we have to be fairly proactive. There are some really skeptical perspectives about the current power dynamic and the ways in which information asymmetry could be used to the benefit of the few, etc., etc. Whether that's actually like reflective of reality, whatever that means, I'm not sure. But I think if we want it, we've got to go after it. And it probably, like as a starting point, I think, this is my perspective, it means transitioning our thinking away from like, privacy versus security or privacy versus personalization. We have the tools and capabilities to have privacy and personalization. And so maybe it's about being more positive sum in our thinking and then working together collaboratively to figure out a lot of this stuff that is really yet to be discovered.
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about the future, and I don't say that to have you leaving the room saying, "Oh, we're good, we got this." But I'm pretty hopeful about the future. I think that you're having people already begin to demand more. I think you have older generations who maybe don't understand what's going on, but now see their kids going through problems and want to see changes. Again, I think you're going to have kids that demand these changes as they grow up and probably even create the technologies that we're not even using today. So I'm really optimistic about the future. Even like simple examples, people thought the world was going to end at Y2K. It didn't. Yeah. So again, don't think that you should not do anything, but I'm pretty hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, the Y2K thing, I think a lot of the preparation seems useless when nothing happens, but you don't want to find out what would have happened if no one cared. One last topic on kind of a note of an economy, like, have either of you seen anything in terms of setting almost like an expiration date on data, whether it's the ability to explicitly delete it or a company must delete it after a certain amount of time? How do you see that play into like data value and like an economic nature of it?
So I'm not an engineer, caveat my answer with that, but I think traceability is a question that is probably unanswered. But there are interesting mechanisms that are emerging. There are like permissions catalogs that are being designed, as in tools that give people the ability to kind of set with almost as much granularity as they like the terms with which their information will be used. Purpose specification and limitation, like that's part of regulation. Like we have to do that. We can't hold data for longer than we need to for the primary processing purpose. So it kind of already exists. I think what we're starting to see emerge is things like personal information management services that might make that a more scalable activity in which individuals can more actively participate.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what he just said, but I think that was good. Also, as a company, I would just challenge you, like, why do you need all the information forever? Are you trying to create the Matrix? There's no other reason to hold it for that long. It's also just costing you more money to hold all that data in servers somewhere. So why would you?
So I'm going to put on my startup hat and say, I'm not sure where I'm going to pivot. I would like all this data just in case. I don't want to be kind of left out in the cold if my business is not what I thought it was initially. So, I mean, what kind of advice would you give to a company that's thinking that way?
It's a really valid perspective, actually. Some of you were giggling. I'm not sure what you thought I would say. It is a really valid perspective. I get it. It's like fear of the unknown, right? There are very simple ways to mechanistically designed for that. Ultimately, if you have a new processing purpose, you need to legitimize that processing activity, and you need to reseek. Consent is just one lawful basis for processing. It's given a lot of emphasis, but it is just one lawful basis for processing information, and it's not the most appropriate in a variety of different contexts. But if your data processing activities are evolving, you've got to engage your customers. And if the value is like easy to understand, it can be appropriated, and you actually enable people to engage with you on that journey, they will have a high propensity to willingly share. You'll get what you need.
Great.
I'm going to take a really, really design answer approach here and say you should create a mock-up prototype and beta test things before you build an entire system. Once it's going, you should have a better idea of what's going on, and then you don't have to collect all the data all the time. And then follow up with everything he said.
Nice. So I think it was mentioned before, sort of the billboard at CES. Apple had this giant sign that can be seen by all the attendees kind of visiting the city. What happens on iPhone stays on iPhone. So they're kind of doing a bit of a dig at some other companies and trying to highlight that, hey, you have an actual advantage, like trust and privacy is an advantage on our platform. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think we'll see more of that? And how would that affect a company that's kind of not the size of Apple that can afford to take out a billboard? Like, how can others kind of follow in those footsteps?
I think in response to what happens to your data stays, or what happens on your phone stays on your phone, I would ask, is it because we had the FaceTime bug where things was coming through? I'm pretty sure Apple's given up data to the government for. So, I don't know. I think Apple's playing that as a big PR move. The fact that they can't keep up with what's going on with Google, Facebook, and any other data player because that was not their get-go. They're a hardware company, not a software company, data company, whatever you want to call it. However, I also think that it should be the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I would say that there are really great interviews of Steve Jobs talking about privacy as a fundamental right. And he made many mistakes in his early days and then kind of went on to found Next and do all this different type of stuff and came back as a more effective, maybe not easy to work with, but a more effective CEO. This is something that seems to be, I've never worked for or with Apple, so I really can't assert this, but it seems to be part of their like explicit values. In 2010, Facebook and other senior stakeholders at Facebook, so Zuckerberg, Mark Andreessen, etc., board members, basically said, and I don't even believe I'm paraphrasing, I think it's almost exactly this: privacy is dead, get over it. And then 8 years later, oh shit, privacy's become this really important thing. How do we change our story? So I think there are actually organizations who have been consistent. As a result of that, they are far from perfect, but they are more likely to appropriately invest in protecting your privacy and security whilst enabling data-driven innovation.
Is there kind of a good example of kind of bucking the trend? And you mentioned this a little, Nathan, of like the take it or leave it approach. Like, you can use our app, or if you don't check the box, you don't have an account. So what's kind of happening instead of that you find promising?
Our work. No, it actually is a part of it, but honestly, what we're doing is pretty niche, right? There are trends that are emerging, like, have you heard of the concept legal design? No. It's like, basically it just means like designers work with lawyers and try and make legal agreements more comprehensible, more interactive, etc. There's some really good work being done on that stuff. There are a variety of different organizations who kind of based on like what they're trying to do, as in personal information management services, self-sovereign identity startups, etc. They have to do this stuff, otherwise they're being disingenuous. Some of their design patterns and experiences are interesting. We're seeing a lot of interesting stuff in the EU. Some of it sucks, but at least it's an attempt, and some of it's really good. I would argue that it's not like material design where 2 billion people are like proactively using this sort of interface and these repeatable design components on a daily basis. We're not there yet, and we might not be there for quite some time, but we're seeing design patterns emerge that do the things that we spoke about. They increase comprehension, they decrease time to comprehension, and they increase people's willingness or propensity to share.
Yeah, so I kind of agree. I don't think there's a lot out there that I'm like, oh, this is so inspiring. I love it. I will let y'all know, though, that coming up in the next few weeks, Harvard will be releasing a 2019 privacy design forecast. I have been helping them, along with other major design firms, to help demonstrate how this stuff might look and operate. So look out for that. Can give you some good ideas on what's coming out and where you could take your system. I have a couple other comments, right? Like, I worked with the team that did Google's privacy dashboards and worked with some of those things. And privacy dashboards are good, and I think that they should be implemented. People should have a right to their data, to access it, to delete it, to control it as they please. However, making dashboards also in many ways is like putting a nutrition label on a Snickers bar, right? We're going to go eat Snickers anyway. If you don't know what's going on, that's the second part of what I said is a big thing for my nonprofit. Is we're helping educate consumers so they know why it's important and how to do those things. So I think both it should be part of the companies to move forward and at the very least give people rights to their data. I do believe that's a human right. But I also think it comes down to education, because without education, people won't even know how to properly use it, and they'll just give more data. So it's balance. Yeah.
So Joe, you had earlier in our presentation mentioned that there's almost a need for a fund and a mandate to push that education, because companies won't necessarily do it if it's against their interest.
Yep. Yeah, I think that would be really important. I think so through some of the lawsuits that have been coming up through data breaches, et cetera, I think that can become some of the funding similar to big tobacco companies. However, in the book, I also cover the idea of maybe we as a community get around the idea of tax breaks for companies that want to focus on data protections, privacy, security, et cetera. Because, like, for example, Google goes through all these court cases, Facebook goes through all these court cases. I don't know if you know, but Google got sued in 2017 for $2.7 billion. I talked to the family who initiated that lawsuit. They gave me a 65-page report of everything that happened through that court case. It went on for 12 years, and Google paid $2.7 billion. Consider that they make almost $90 billion a year. They made about $1 trillion and said, well, I'm just going to kind of wipe my backside with that $2.7 billion. So I think it actually might be wiser to give companies incentives, financial incentives to move forward. And when you think how that plays out at scale, going back to the startups right now, as a startup, you're getting punished by the GDPR up to 4% of your revenue for some of these things, versus what if you got a tax break and as a startup that incentivized you to be privacy first? I think there are ways to operate differently and to move forward faster in a way that's more meaningful to our communities.
So one last question we had on sort of the government approach. Have you seen the data dividends plan for California, and what are your thoughts on that if you have?
Have you?
I have not. I've seen the the Privacy Act. I haven't read the whole thing. That's on my reading list. But no, I haven't.
What is it?
I don't know. It was a question that came from okay.
There's a lot of new stuff coming out really fast, though.
Very, very quick. Go ahead.
Yeah.
The state of California's been talking about allowing people to get paid
Yeah.
for their data, right? So
Okay.
I give you access to my data and you use it,
Yeah.
you have to pay me a portion of it. So every time you use it, I get paid on it. At the end of the year,
Yeah.
it's tallied up and I get sent a check.
Right.
Cool. So I've thought about that too. I do talk about that a bit in my book. I do think that is the future. I do think that data creation is modern thought labor, and we should be paid for the work we're doing for these companies, right? Google could create Google Maps from scratch. They just have to go and spend a lot of time taking pictures and videos of the world, and they'd have to hire billions of people to get it done. They didn't. They've used us unpaid. So I do agree that we should get it. I think it's tough to have that conversation because if people think that their privacy is a threat now, wait till they have to track every single thing you do. Wait till they have to be extra precise with who you are and where you've been and what you're doing and how they weigh that individually. Wait until they have to clean your data. That's going to be awkward. you're not worth their money, so they're just going to get rid of your data. What does that mean? Some of the conversations that we're going to have to get those laws in place are going to be really touchy. And I do believe, like I said, that it is the future, but it's not going to be an easy conversation, and it's definitely not going to happen that quick.
I might just add to that by saying personal data marketplaces, as in marketplaces that enable individuals to monetize their data, have been around for a long time in the private sector, at least 5 years. There was a perspective maybe 5 to 8 years ago that it was a really interesting model. But if you think about kind of the propensity that organizations have to pay for information, who wins? It's rich people, right? Because you're basically looking at like buying power, right? How much shit can I sell you? And so disenfranchised communities get left out. And so the people who could actually benefit from like, pardon the terminology, but kind of like a universal basic data income, they're not the ones that will get it. And so I think we're further pushing inequality unnecessarily. And I would argue that we can do so much more by orchestrating the flow of the right data at the right time. And it could be, I don't know, as an example, right? Like if I use a personal information management service that just operates like on my devices, right? I don't have to actively engage with it, and I get rushed to the hospital, this thing knows everything about me. I'm not going to be squabbling with the surgeon. Are you giving me $20? Just save my life, right? Like data can be utilized to enable real life outcomes. And I think if we think about, well, what are those real life outcomes that we're designing for? How can we utilize data to enable us to achieve those outcomes more effectively? We can potentially balance the benefit more effectively than via something like a universal basic data income.
Great, thank you. It would be ideal if, if you send the questions in, we'll pick them at certain times. So it would be ideal if everyone in a company, no matter what they were doing, were very aware of kind of data policies and all of these. But let's say you just want to get started. Are there certain key roles that you should consider, or certain groups you train first? What's at the executive level? What's at other levels? Like, how would you get started?
So I've spoken about that governance piece, right? Like if you speak to boards, they understand the concept of governance, set strategy, identify and manage risk. I would argue that a lot of the businesses that we would classify as information businesses aren't adept in information governance yet. So there's an argument to be made that getting in there really matters. We've seen great success when the CEO, like Benioff's quote, right? You better decide that trust is your highest value. That's a really interesting perspective. But if you start talking about tacticians and practitioners, I think that there are different individuals within the organization who can have a significant impact. I think design is absolutely one. I think data sciences is another, particularly in the context of like, if you look at the work that's being done on like algorithmic transparency and explainability and bias, etc., like almost taking a stance, like I won't do this thing unless we can verify, that we're maximizing good and minimizing bad. So there's a practitioner's perspective. Legal departments, privacy practitioners, data protection practitioners, like they got to evolve their approach. I understand that a lot of organizations design their sort of terms of service as a hedge against class action lawsuits. You can still have that. But you utilize things like layering as design techniques because you want individuals to be informed, empowered, and capable of making choices. I don't think there's one individual. Our take is that convincing people takes too much time. The opportunity cost is too high. So we focus on finding the individuals who are already convinced, figuring out what is their stakeholder map, what are the attitudes and behaviors that we need to shift internally, and then how do we actually orchestrate that, and then press go.
Great.
Yeah, I'm gonna somewhat agree in the fact that in a business model you have to figure out who is most ready to go, and then figure out the way to narrow things up the ladder. But if I had the ideal situation, I think you do need to come from the top. We need support from the people at the top in order to make changes. And if they are blind to the options, if they aren't willing to have the conversation, it just won't happen. So ideally, it starts at the top. And if not, then you do the best you can.
Yeah, I think, Nathan, what you were saying is even as like a machine learning practitioner, it's up to you to start understanding more how bias can creep in and how those things can really be explained. Some of them are fairly complex statistics, and if you talk to the CEO and you show him a bunch of formulas, you may not get your best outcome. So learning not only the math behind it, but how to explain it and how to represent it can really make it easier to get more change in your company, because you can't assume ill intent all the time, sometimes just a lack of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a fundamental question that's being asked, which is effectively, what is the business value of trust? What is the business value of ethics? Philosophically, I think we kind of all get it, right? But how do you, organizations have a bias towards quantitative information. Sometimes far too much so. How do you kind of quantify some of this stuff? And I think, at least our approach, right? And again, the market's early. We're trying to figure a lot of this stuff out, but we focus on building a body of evidence as quickly and cost effectively as we can that showcases the explicit relationship between trust and data sharing. If executives believe they are going to get access to more of the right information, that's the key, they might buy into the initiative. But if you have no body of evidence and you're just kind of, presenting this philosophical standpoint, then you're really like you're shooting, darts. Like, will this person buy into my perspective? There's no guarantee. The body of evidence is absolutely key.
So speaking of body evidence, my next question is about metrics. Metrics can be kind of weaponized and used for good or bad. Metrics to your salespeople to sign a lot of loans have obviously gone bad in numerous ways. Some of them loans to people that don't even actually exist, let alone people that can't actually afford it. So what are some examples of good metrics on this kind of axis of finding a place for trust and privacy? And are there any kind of warnings that you've seen companies that thought they were doing a good thing by setting a metric and it actually backfired, and we should be aware of that?
Absolutely. So propensity to willingly share information is one of the things that I spoke about earlier. At the moment, because of the way that data sharing events occur, they're not typically informed. We've learned the behavior of just getting onto the thing that we want and bypassing all the stuff because it's unnecessary cognitive load. It's impossible to deal with. If an organization's early in their journey and they go, 93% of people have a propensity to willingly share. No way. They've learned the behavior of ticking the box or not unticking the box so that they can get the outcome that they want. So you have to follow that quant up with something like contextual inquiry. If you start with an understanding of the what, you've got to build an understanding of the why. Our perspective is also that there are broader business metrics that need to be addressed. In one of our playbooks, we talk about a theory called VME design, and we talk about how to put it into practice. Value, meaning, and engagement. Value is about outcomes. Meaning is about the relative priority of those outcomes, and engagement is about the fun experienced attaining the outcome. We've actually started working with a bunch of our clients, or have for the last couple of years, to figure out, well, how do you actually put that into practice? And do those types of metrics that are inherently person or customer-centric or citizen-centric or patient-centric, do they replace, do they complement, do they augment an existing organizational sort of set of metrics? Uncertain. I think there's a sort of multi-year change pathway, but we've got to rethink some of this stuff and find a way to align organizations to the actual outcomes that the people, the individuals they serve care about.
Yeah, I think I'm going to continue on that quantitative approach a bit. Quantitative metrics are great at figuring out places to look, etc. But they don't tell you all the details. I think that there aren't a lot of great examples out there of companies that are trying to do this. I can give you a simple example. Couchsurfing tries to do things where they measure how many days you spent with someone and subtract the time that you were spending on the device in their application, and then have qualitative responses afterwards to follow up and see how it actually was and compare the reality of things. I think you see Netflix, who, for example, just about a year ago, found someone was binging on Netflix for almost a week straight, decided to call them to see, hey, is everything okay? And it turns out the person was depressed, and they did change his life. That decision wasn't necessarily best for Netflix's bottom line, but I mean, I've worked for startups where they say, hey, this guy, it just cost us $250 to return his gear or whatever, and that's okay with us because we just made a lifetime customer. I think we have to, as companies, find a balance here on, are we just going to drive for the numbers, or are we going to work for the long term?